You hit your head with the sink, Lucy said. Mom, I saw it. It was a ghost. I began to speak faster, but my mother looked at me as if I had grown 3 heads. What are you talking about? That blow left you hallucinating. She spoke as she shook her head. I looked around the room again, confused, but I didn't see anything. My mother grabbed the blankets and buried me underneath. Just rest, okay? She said, smiling. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't just a hallucination. As my mother left the room, I felt a presence around me. I tried to sit up, but a force shoved the blankets away, leaving me unprotected. Desperately, I felt my eyes filling with tears as I grabbed a pillow to use it as a shield. My eyes toured the room as I watched the blanket now lying on the floor. The room was quiet, and the yellow blanket began to lift itself from the floor. I widened my eyes in shock when the blanket flew quickly towards me. I leaned backward, but my head hit the back of the bed, causing me to grimace in pain. The blanket stopped in front of me and slowly dropped to my legs, revealing the same pair of dark eyes I met yesterday. This time the face was a bit more defined, but I could still look through it. I opened my mouth to scream, but it shook its head and motioned me to keep quiet. I said, I won't hurt you. I nodded slowly as my eyes widened in terror. Don't scream nor run. I just want to talk. I nodded again, hesitantly, rushing to cover myself. I grabbed the blanket and used it as a shield. The vision in front of me rolled its eyes and shook its head. Am I that ugly? My eyes widened even more at the dumb question. I couldn't understand why he was asking such questions right now. Excuse me? I tilted my head. The vision shook its head again, and now I realized it was a boy. He had messy, dirty blonde hair and intense black eyes with thick eyebrows and voluptuous lips. I also noticed he had large ears, which gave him a strange, cute look. I swallowed hard and relaxed a bit, but never letting my guard down. About what? My words came out as a whisper while I stammered. Nervousness grew inside my belly and went up to my heart. About you. I'm curious, he said, tilting his head. I would constantly look at the door, wishing my mom would rush inside so she could see that I wasn't crazy, and there was actually a ghost in my room. But seconds passed, and she didn't come. What are you? Are you a ghost? I asked, shocked. The boy tilted his head as if it was an odd question. A ghost? What are you talking about? I am an apparition, he said, pointing to his translucent body. I tilted my head in confusion. Isn't it the same? The boy widened his eyes and looked a bit hurt for a second. Of course not. I am not a common thing like a ghost. I swallowed hard and nodded. Okay. So what's your name? He asked, looking into my eyes. I noticed the incredible black pits that his eyes were. They looked a bit absent, though. My name is Lily Smith, and you? He swallowed hard and looked down. I can't remember it. But you can call me Avi, he said, now looking at me as a smile formed on his full lips. I narrowed my eyes as I tilted my head. Soon the vision of him vanished, and my mother rushed into the room with towels on her hand. Come on, let's get that fever down, she said, placing a wet towel on my forehead. I narrowed my eyes and thought about maybe the conversation I had a few seconds ago was a product of a hallucination due to my fever. I woke up to the cold breeze, having fallen asleep after my mom gave me medicine for my fever. The window was open and the night air had sneaked into my room. I stood up from my bed and closed the window. When I turned around, I found someone staring at me. I could see the clock behind him. It marked 3:29 a.m. Something in the boy's face told me that he was the one who opened the window. Did you open the window? I asked, but the vision in front of me disappeared. I looked down and sighed. It was ridiculous. I couldn't talk to a ghost in my room. It didn't make any sense. He didn't exist. You don't exist? It's just the fever, I started to say, but I couldn't finish the sentence when the pair of dark eyes appeared right in front of me. You were saying? He asked, crossing his arms on his chest. I shouted in surprise, widening my eyes and stumbling as I took some steps backward. I almost hit the floor if it wasn't for the blurry vision that held me. I quickly moved away and hugged myself. He was cold. With widened eyes, I stared at him. I wasn't crazy. He was standing in front of me. Not even a thanks? He asked, narrowing his eyes. Why are we talking at all? I asked, annoyed. It wasn't normal for a person to be talking to a ghost. It was confusing. We shouldn't be talking. He raised an eyebrow, demanding better manners from me. I looked at him, shocked. Rolling my eyes, I looked away. Thank you, I said hesitantly. It was weird to thank a ghost for such a thing. I received a smile from the vision. Did you? I asked, pointing to the window. He nodded. Why? I asked, confused. I couldn't think of a reason why he would open the window. I thought you didn't want to talk to me, he said, giving his back to me. I looked at him, bewildered. His attitude was strange. It was almost as if he was a human. After a few seconds of silence, he deigned to speak. It was getting hot in here, he said casually. I swallowed hard and walked towards my bed slowly. This is so weird. I'm sure this is a dream anyway, I said. It's not, he said, offended, as he followed me and sat at the edge of the bed. I looked at him and furrowed my eyebrows. What are you doing here then? I asked. This is my place, he said, looking around my room. I followed his eyes, and then my black eyes met my brown orbs. This is my room, I said, crossing my arms on my chest. He copied me. It's mine too. So you should get accustomed, he said, moving his lips slowly. I remained silent for a couple of seconds as I stared at the vision in front of me. I wondered what his genesis was. Where did he come from? How did he appear here? Was this his previous house? Why don't you ask all of those questions instead? I opened my eyes widely and soon felt my hands shaking. Did you read my mind? I asked, my voice trembling. He chuckled and shook his head. No, but judging by the look on your face, it was pretty obvious that you wanted to ask me something, so go ahead, he said eagerly as he moved and sat better in front of me. I blinked twice and shook my head. Please go. I don't think you should be here. The boy rolled his eyes and leaned back, resting his body on his hands. You're seriously boring, he complained, moving his hand, and suddenly the hairbrush that was laying on top of my vanity moved and collapsed on the floor. I turned to look at him in shock. I'll have all night, and you have plenty of stuff. So you decide, he said calmly. I blinked twice as I clenched my fists. Fine. What was your name again? He narrowed his eyes, offended that I had forgotten his name. Just call me Avi. Avi? I asked, tilting my head. Yeah. I can't remember my full name, and not that it's important, right? Now I get to ask a question, he said, narrowing his eyes to the ceiling as if he was thinking. What are you doing? I blurted out. Avi looked down at me with a confused expression, thinking about my question. Nobody said you could ask me questions. Nobody said you could ask me questions either. You think you're the only one who has questions? I have mine too. It's nothing but fair, so shut up. I frowned and crossed my arms on my chest, shaking my head. I thought he was truly annoying. Got it. Lily Smith, how old are you? I am 20, and you? I asked. He looked down and stood from the bed. I can't remember. Is that your family downstairs? His voice was more audible now. I wondered if my mother and sister would listen to him. Yes, only them? Don't you have a father or more siblings? I thought it was my turn, I defiantly said. Avi narrowed his eyes and gave up, lifting his hands. Go ahead. Where are you from? I asked curiously. Judging by his face, he was clueless. He just looked down and shook his head. I can't remember either. Do you remember at least something? I asked, annoyed. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw how his eyes became lost. I swallowed hard, not knowing what to do. I remember water. I looked at him with a clueless expression, and just when I was about to say something, he disappeared. I looked around the room, but I met my clock, which marked 3:55 a.m. It was late after all, and I needed to sleep since tomorrow I was returning to college. Quickly, I buried my face in the pillow and... It was late after all, and I needed to sleep since tomorrow I was returning to college. Quickly, I buried my face in the pillow and threw the blanket on top of me. Closing my eyes, Avi's eyes popped into my head after I asked the question. I could tell by the look on his face that it had affected him. My question had touched a nerve. I decided not to give too much importance to it and gave in to the world of dreams. The deafening sound of the alarm woke me up. I opened my eyes and rushed to unlock my phone to stop the alarm. I returned to the bed and stared at the white ceiling. It was hard for me to return to college after all I'd been through. Quickly, I got up from the bed and rushed to the bathroom. After taking a cold shower and putting on my uniform, I made my way downstairs and had breakfast with my sister and mother. Lucy was going to show me the way to the college since it was new for me. It's quite easy, you'll get used to it in a short time. You're smart like me, Lucy said, winking and pinching my cheeks. I smiled tenderly at my sister. This is your school, Lucy said after we got off from the subway station and walked 2 streets down. I eyed the facade and nodded. Yes, I think I can return home alone, I said, looking at my sister. Lucy narrowed her eyes. She wasn't sure if this was true. Are you sure? I nodded in answer. Okay, you can always call me or Mom, okay? Lucy asked, but I nodded. I was sure I had memorized the way back. Go ahead or you'll be late now, Lucy said, smiling at me. I nodded and made my way inside. The college was big enough for me to get lost in on the first day. I liked the fact that it looked clean and organized. I walked through the administration office to get my schedule. Lily Smith? The lady behind the counter said cheerfully. I looked at her confused. I didn't understand how she knew my name if this was the first time I was here. Excuse me, have we met before? I asked. The woman looked nervous and shook her head. No, but your mother came and showed a picture of how you look like. She wanted you to feel welcome the first day, and she wanted us to know who you were, she clarified. Even though the woman tried to look cool, I noticed she was acting weird, but I decided to let it go. I received my schedule and said thanks, bowing to the woman. I walked through the halls until I found my classroom. After knocking on the door, the teacher opened the door and smiled at me. Welcome. Please come in, he said, and I followed him. The class had already started, so I apologized to the teacher for my late arrival, but he seemed to be okay with it since he said, there was no problem since this was my first day. Okay, class, pay attention. The teacher started and then turned around to look at me. Can you introduce yourself? I nodded and turned to look at the eager faces who were staring at me. I cleared my throat and nodded. Hi, my name is Lily Smith. I am 20 years old and I am from here, I said, looking now at the teacher seeking approval. He nodded and indicated my seat. The class was quiet and I felt all eyes on me. I thought it was normal since I got transferred here after we moved. Maybe they were all curious about me being the new student. But I tried to focus on the subject. After the first class finished, I grabbed my things and did my way out of the building. But when I heard my name, I stopped and turned around. Lily Smith, a male voice called me. My eyes met a pair of brown orbs that seemed to be eagerly happy. Yes? I asked, confused since I didn't know the boy's name, although his face was familiar. I remembered him from the class. Oh, right, he said, clearing his throat. Kim Namjoon? We're together in class, he said, pointing to the school behind us. I nodded. Yes. Nice to meet you, Namjoon, I said, bowing, and he smiled. I noticed he was considerably tall and had cute dimples. I noticed you were alone. Were you returning to your house now? He asked, and I nodded. He swallowed hard and smiled. Do you want me to escort you to the subway? If it's not too weird for you? I looked at him, confused, but I was too taken aback to reject him, so I nodded. Let's go, he said, walking next to me. We both remained silent, walking next to each other. Namjoon would eventually turn around and stare at me, but once I realized it, he'd look away and curse himself mentally for his lack of touch. So did you like the new school? He asked once we reached the subway station, as we waited for the train. I think it's fine. How long have you been attending it? I asked without looking at him. Namjoon was surprised at the fact that I looked like I wasn't too interested in talking to him, so he thought he just had to try harder. Only 6 years. My family moved from Goyang 6 years ago, so, he said, and now I looked at him. Are you from Goyang? He nodded. I remembered my father. He was born and raised in Goyang. Soon my heart filled with sadness as I missed him. Namjoon noticed and he cleared his throat. Have you visited it, perhaps? I nodded. My father was born there. Namjoon nodded. I am sure he was a great man then, he said, smiling tenderly. I nodded as I looked at the floor, but then I slowly turned around and looked at him. Was? I asked, confused. Namjoon opened his eyes widely and began to stammer. I meant is... I was trying to say is. I frowned. Suddenly the train arrived and Namjoon breathed in relief once the doors opened. He followed me and sat next to me on the train. I am sorry. I am clumsy with words. I didn't mean to offend you nor your family. It's okay. He's gone anyway, I said, looking away. I am sorry to hear that. Do you have more family, perhaps? Namjoon asked as he examined my profile. He noticed how long my hair was and how soft it looked. I couldn't help but notice the way he blushed at my physical charms. I do. My mom and my sister. And you? I replied, surprising him by looking directly at him. He jumped in surprise, looked away, and then at the floor. I couldn't help but giggle at his awkwardness. I am an only child, and both parents are working all the time, so yes, that's my life, he said, and I smiled. It seems like you almost hate it? I asked, tilting my head, and Namjoon laughed. No, It's better off that way. They're not breathing down my neck all the time because they're busy. He joked, but I only smiled. I thought he didn't know how lucky he was to have both parents alive. This is my stop, I said, once I heard the lady's voice announcing we had arrived at my destination. Namjoon nodded and stood with me at the same time. I eyed him a bit confused. It's mine too, Namjoon said with a nervous laugh. I tilted my head and narrowed my eyes. Okay, I said as I walked next to him. We both made our way out of the subway and began to walk. I noticed how Namjoon looked so sure about these streets, and I thought maybe he was telling the truth. So where do you live? I asked. 5 streets up. And you? He asked, looking at me. Only 2. We live relatively close, I said, and he smiled. I think that's good. Maybe we can be friends, he said, and I stopped walking. Namjoon widened his eyes, terrified that his suggestion had upset me. I am sorry. I didn't mean that way. I mean, I am stupid. I am so sorry, he said, closing his eyes. And I chuckled. This is my house, I said, and he stopped his dramatic burst, looking at the house behind me. Right, he smiled, and the dimples moved. Your house. You have a pretty house. Thanks. I guess I'll see you around, Kim Namjoon, I spoke softly, and he nodded. Yes, Lily Smith, he replied. I smiled and turned around, walking to my house. Namjoon looked at the house and then at my back. He waited for me to come inside and noticed my mother waiting for me at the door. He smiled and waved at the lady, and she did the same. Who was that? My mother asked once I arrived at the door. Just some weird guy from school. Apparently, he lives in the same street, I said, closing the door behind me and making my way to the kitchen. He looks quite nice. He's really tall and handsome, my mother giggled. Mom, I just met him today, I scolded her playfully. My sister Lucy rolled her eyes as she poured juice into a glass for me. Still, he's so polite to escort you to your house, my mother said. Mom, it was just pure coincidence, I said, taking the whole juice as a single shot and standing from the table. How was your first day then? My mother asked, following me to the living room. It was okay, everyone was nice. And the lady on the administration already knew me, I said, laughing. My mother opened her eyes widely and smiled nervously. Ah, yes. I showed her a picture of you so she could recognize you on the first date. She was pretty good at remembering. Thank you, Mum, I said, kissing my mother's cheeks and making my way upstairs. The second floor was quiet and a bit colder than the one downstairs. I walked carelessly through the hall and stopped in front of my door. I grabbed the latch and turned it around. But when I pushed the door, it was locked from the inside. I took a step back and frowned. Soon I realized that down in the space between the door and the floor, I saw a shadow moving. I sighed and closed my eyes as I tried again to open the door. I tried several times and pushed the door, but it remained closed. My mother heard the noises and came upstairs. What's going on? She asked as she saw me pushing the door open. The door won't open. I stopped talking when I noticed the door was open now in front of me. My mother frowned and shook her head as she mumbled something and returned downstairs. I turned around and stood on the doorframe looking around, but there was no one. I walked in and closed the door behind me. I stood still in the middle of the room looking everywhere, until I stopped and sat at the edge of my bed. I was removing my shoes when one was thrown at me. Ouch, I complained once the pain became present. Soon Avi appeared in front of me. What do you think you're doing? I exclaimed, standing from the bed and facing him. My fists were clenched, and my face had a big frown. He remained silent, looking at me with an angry face. Throwing a shoe at you, it's pretty obvious, he replied. Yeah, I exclaimed, crossing my arms on my chest. I thought this was ridiculous. I was pissed at a ghost. Shaking my head, I grabbed the shoes from the floor and took them to the walk-in closet. When I turned around to return to my room, the door was shut violently in my face. I tripped with the shoes and fell, sitting on the floor. I groaned in frustration and felt how my eyes filled with tears. After a few seconds, I stood from the floor and tried to open the door. But it was locked from outside. Yeah, you! Let me out now, I exclaimed, annoyed. But the room was silent. I sighed loudly and leaned my forehead on the door. The situation was extremely ridiculous. I thought about telling my mother again, but I was sure no one would believe me. For how long are you going to keep me here? This isn't right, yeah, I exclaimed, knocking the door, but no one replied. I sighed heavily again and closed my eyes. After a few minutes of silence, I finally heard the voice. Who was that? I lifted my head and looked at the door as if it had grown 3 heads. What? Confusion in my voice made him realize I had no clue what he was talking about. He groaned quietly and came closer to the door. I felt a cold breeze coming from the other side of the door. "That guy outside," he whispered. I frowned and took a step backward. "A classmate?" He looked away and unlocked the door. I looked at how the door opened itself and noticed how Avi was now sitting on the vanity's chair. He only shrugged and remained silent. I walked outside the closet and stood in front of him with my hands on my waist. "Why did you lock me inside?" "That wasn't very nice of you." "Who said I was nice in the first place?" he asked, facing me with mischievous eyes. I felt goosebumps running through my body as I swallowed hard. His look was quite scary now. So I began to walk backward when he stood from the chair and walked towards me. "Don't get mistaken. Just because I wanted to know your name and age doesn't mean we're friends," he said, cornering me against the wall. I just nodded as an answer. He blinked twice and disappeared. I closed my eyes and sighed heavily.